I want to tell you a story the way Auntie May would tell it, plain, steady and strong, because this is not a story about scandal. It is a story about clarity, about dignity, and about what happens when your heart hears something it can never unhear and still chooses to stand up straight. This is about the moment betrayal stops being a rumor and becomes a decision point, the moment you decide whether you will shrink or rise. I arrived earlier than I was supposed to, and before my hand even reached the door my body understood something my mind was not ready to admit. That is how truth often arrives, not with a shout but with a pressure in the chest, a slowing of breath, a sense that the ground has shifted beneath your feet. I stood there and saw her car outside, and nothing else needed to be explained because the silence around that moment was already loud. Auntie May always said life will warn you before it wounds you, but the warning will be quiet, and if you are not listening you will miss it. I was listening even though I did not know it yet. People think betrayal announces itself with dramatic scenes and raised voices, but most of the time it shows up as a stillness that does not belong. The air feels heavier, the light feels different, your instincts step forward before your thoughts can catch up. That car sitting there was not just metal and paint, it was a message, it was a sign asking me whether I trusted myself enough to accept what I was seeing instead of rushing to excuse it away from the noise of denial. The truth has a simple shape, and I was staring straight at it. In that moment memories rushed in, not as pictures but as feelings. All the times I had ignored small discomforts, all the nights I had told myself I was overthinking, all the times my intuition tapped me on the shoulder and I told it to wait. This was the bill coming due. Auntie May used to say, when you keep postponing the truth it gathers interest, and one day it collects all at once. Standing there I felt that collection happen not with anger but with clarity. There is something humbling about realizing that your body knew before your heart was ready. The heart wants to protect hope, it wants to keep believing in the version of the story that feels safest, but the body is loyal to reality. It reacts without politics or excuses, it tightens, it stills, it prepares you for what is next. I listened to my body that day, and by listening I took the first step toward self-respect. I could have turned away, I could have decided to come back later and pretend I saw nothing. That would have been easier in the moment, but Auntie May taught me that easy now often becomes unbearable later. Facing truth early, even when it hurts, saves you from a deeper pain down the road. I stayed because I needed to know whether I would choose courage or comfort, and I chose courage even though my hands were shaking. Seeing that car did not immediately make me angry, it made me aware. Awareness is powerful because it removes confusion. Confusion keeps you stuck, awareness sets you free. Even before any words were spoken I knew something sacred had been crossed, and once something sacred is crossed, pretending otherwise only dishonors yourself. I thought about how many people spend years arguing with signs. They debate them down, they minimize them, they say it is probably nothing. Auntie May would shake her head and say, probably is how people lose decades of their lives. Probably is the word people use when they are afraid of certainty. I decided that day that I would not build my future on probably. That moment outside taught me that clarity does not require confrontation right away. Sometimes clarity is simply the ability to stand still and tell yourself the truth without rushing to fix anything. I did not need to storm in or make a scene. I needed to breathe and remember who I was before I started explaining away disrespect. The car was not just evidence of another person, it was evidence of a pattern of me being asked to accept less than honesty, a pattern of me being patient with things that were slowly eroding my peace. Auntie May said patterns are promises, and that pattern was promising more pain if I ignored it. I realized then that self-respect begins before the confrontation, before the questions, before the explanations. Self-respect begins the moment you accept what you see and refuse to gaslight yourself. That day I stopped arguing with my own eyes, I stopped doubting my instincts, I stopped negotiating with my inner voice. There is a strange calm that comes when you finally tell yourself the truth. Even painful truth brings relief because it ends the exhausting work of pretending. My shoulders dropped, my breathing slowed. I felt sad, but I also felt grounded, like someone who had finally put both feet on solid ground after walking on shaky boards. Auntie May used to say the first betrayal is the one someone commits against you, the second is the one you commit against yourself by refusing to see it. I chose not to commit the second betrayal. That choice changed everything that came after. Standing there I understood that love does not require blindness, love requires honesty, starting with yourself. The sign outside was enough. It was not cruel, it was not dramatic, it was simply clear, and clarity is a gift even when it arrives wrapped in disappointment. That moment taught me that listening to yourself is an act of courage. The world will always offer you excuses, but your intuition offers you truth. Choosing truth is rarely comfortable, but it is always liberating. I did not yet know how the story would unfold, but I knew one thing for certain: I would not abandon myself to keep a situation intact. The car outside was the beginning of my awakening. It was the line between who I had been and who I was becoming. Auntie May would later say, see how life stopped you before you went any further, see how it gave you a chance to turn around with your dignity whole. That was not the end of my pain, but it was the end of my confusion. From that moment on, I promised myself something simple and unbreakable. I would trust what I see, I would honor what I feel, I would never again need permission to believe my own experience. That promise became my anchor. And that is why the sign before the sound matters, because once you learn to listen to the quiet warnings life sends you, you stop being surprised by heartbreak, you start being guided by wisdom, and wisdom always arrives softly first, waiting to see if you are brave enough to listen. Inside the house the sound came quietly, almost politely, and that is what made it devastating. It was a whisper, not raised, not dramatic, not angry, and that softness is what cut the deepest, because when harm arrives gently it bypasses your defenses and goes straight to the center. I heard his voice, lowered and familiar, and then the words followed, words that were never meant to be shared, words that carried ownership and appetite instead of respect. In that instant something sacred collapsed. Auntie May used to say, some sentences change the shape of your life forever, and you never forget where you were standing when you heard them. I did not need to hear more than that single line, because it revealed everything I needed to know. It revealed how he saw her, it revealed how he spoke when he thought no one was listening, it revealed that intimacy had been turned into performance and affection into conquest. What shattered me was not just what he said, but how easily he said it. There was no hesitation, no awareness of consequence, no sense of partnership in his voice that told me this was not a mistake. Whispered in panic, but a comfort spoken with confidence, and comfort in betrayal is the clearest truth of all. People think betrayal requires discovery of details, dates, messages, explanations, but Auntie May would shake her head and say, baby, when the mask slips, even for a second, believe what you see. That whisper was the mask slipping. It showed me the private version of him, the one I was never supposed to meet. In that moment my heart wanted to jump in and interrupt, to demand, to cry, to rage, but my spirit stood still and watched, because clarity had arrived, and clarity does not shout, it simply stands there waiting to see if you will accept it. I realized then that words are powerful, not because they are loud, but because they reveal intent. Those words were not about desire, they were about dominance, they were about possession, and once you hear someone speak that way you cannot unhear it, you cannot pretend it was taken out of context, because context lives in tone and timing and secrecy. Auntie May taught me that truth often enters through the ear before it reaches the heart, and when it does you must decide whether you will close the door or let it sit with you. I let it sit with me even though it burned. There was grief in that moment, but there was also a strange release, because uncertainty ended. I was no longer wondering why things felt off or why my spirit had been restless. The whisper explained the silence, the distance, the shift I had been feeling for months. It connected the dots I had been too kind to connect myself. I felt something important happen inside me right then. A line was drawn, not out of anger but out of awareness. I knew I would never again beg for honesty from someone who could lie so comfortably in a whisper. That sentence ended my need for arguments or investigations. I did not need to check phones or ask questions or chase confessions, because when someone reveals who they are in private speech, that is the truest testimony you will ever receive. Auntie May used to say, pay attention to how people talk when they think you are not around. That is where their real values live. I heard his values in that whisper, and they did not align with mine. It hurt in a way that was sharp but clean. There was no confusion mixed in, no back and forth, no maybe I misunderstood. It was pain with edges, and edges heal cleaner than blurred wounds. I also realized something about myself in that moment. I realized I was strong enough to hear the truth without breaking, strong enough to let it land without collapsing, strong enough to choose dignity over drama. The whisper taught me that betrayal does not always come wrapped in cruelty. Sometimes it comes wrapped in familiarity. That is what makes it dangerous, because you trust the voice, you recognize the tone, and that familiarity is what allows the damage to go deep. But Auntie May would say, familiar pain is still pain, and you do not stay just because it is familiar. Standing there I felt my heart grieving not just the relationship but the version of him I believed in. That version dissolved with that sentence, and once a belief dissolves you cannot rebuild it with hope alone. I did not feel the need to confront right away, because the truth had already spoken louder than any argument ever could. Sometimes the most powerful response is silence paired with clarity. That whisper also reminded me of my worth, because nothing exposes disrespect faster than hearing how someone talks when they think no one is listening, and hearing it made me realize I deserved a love that spoke of me with honor even in my absence. Auntie May always said, when someone tells you the truth quietly, believe them loudly. I believed him that day, and believing him saved me years of self-doubt. I walked away from that moment changed, not hardened but awakened. I understood that love without respect is not love at all, and respect does not disappear accidentally, it leaves intentionally. The words he whispered did not just end something, they freed something in me, they freed my voice, my boundaries, my future. I learned that day that some sentences are doors. Once you hear them you cannot go back to who you were before, and that is not a loss, that is a beginning. I carried that lesson forward. I stopped ignoring what words reveal. I stopped minimizing private speech. I stopped explaining away behavior that contradicted values. Because when the whisper comes and it tells you the truth, the bravest thing you can do is listen, and once you listen you are no longer lost, you are simply on your way out and on your way up. After the shock settled there was a quiet space where time seemed to pause, and in that space a choice waited for me, not a loud choice, not a dramatic one, but a simple, honest one about who I would stand with. In the aftermath I felt my heart pull in two directions. One direction led toward confrontation, toward demanding explanations, toward asking questions I already knew the answers to. The other direction led inward toward myself, toward the small steady voice that said, this is where you decide who you are. Auntie May always said life will back you into corners so you can finally see what you are made of, not to punish you but to reveal you. And standing there I understood that this was one of those corners. There was no audience, no applause, no one to tell me what the right move was. There was only me and the truth, and the decision of whether I would abandon myself to preserve something already broken. Choosing yourself sounds powerful when people say it on stages and print it on posters, but in real life it is quiet and lonely and heavy. It feels like letting go of familiar pain for uncertain peace. It feels like walking away without a guarantee that what comes next will be easier. But Auntie May taught me that self-respect is not chosen because it is easy, it is chosen because it is necessary. I noticed my breathing before I noticed my thoughts. It slowed when I decided not to rush. It steadied when I told myself that I did not owe anyone immediate reactions. I owed myself care, I owed myself time, I owed myself honesty. That was the moment I chose myself, not by saying anything out loud but by deciding what I would no longer tolerate. There is pressure in moments like that to perform pain, to cry loudly, to confront dramatically, to make sure everyone knows you have been wronged. But choosing yourself does not require performance, it requires presence, it requires staying grounded when everything inside you wants to scatter. I remembered Auntie May sitting at the kitchen table telling me that dignity is not something you defend with words, it is something you carry with posture, with silence, with restraint. She said, when you know your worth you do not chase explanations, you set standards. And in that moment I felt my spine straighten, not with pride but with resolve. I realized that chasing answers would keep me tied to the wound, but choosing myself would start the healing. Even if healing felt distant, even if it felt lonely, even if it meant walking away without closure, I understood that closure is something you give yourself, not something someone else hands you. There was grief in choosing myself, because choosing yourself often means letting go of the future you imagined, letting go of the person you hoped someone would become, letting go of the belief that love alone could fix what respect had broken. I allowed myself to feel that grief without turning back. I thought about all the times I had made myself smaller to keep peace, all the times I had swallowed discomfort to avoid conflict, all the times I had been patient past the point of self-respect, and I knew that if I did not choose myself now I would keep repeating that pattern, because patterns do not change unless someone interrupts them. Choosing yourself is not an act of aggression, it is an act of alignment. It is saying my values and my actions will match. It is deciding that I will not participate in situations that require me to doubt my worth. I did not feel brave in that moment, I felt scared, but Auntie May said courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision that something else matters more than fear, and what mattered more to me was my integrity. I felt the urge to speak, to explain, to ask, to clarify, but I stopped myself because I knew that explanations would only invite manipulation and questions would only invite partial truths. I had already received the clearest message I needed, and respecting myself meant respecting that clarity. I chose myself by deciding not to beg for reassurance. I chose myself by deciding not to accept apologies without accountability. I chose myself by deciding not to stay where I was not honored. That choice did not make the pain disappear, but it changed the direction of my pain. Instead of turning inward as self-blame, it turned outward as self-protection. That shift saved me. I understood that choosing yourself is a practice, not a single moment. It begins with one decision, but it continues with daily actions, with boundaries, with follow-through, with saying no even when your voice shakes. Auntie May used to say, you teach people how to treat you by what you allow, and I realized that choosing myself meant changing what I allowed, even if it meant disappointing others, even if it meant being misunderstood. I accepted that I would not be seen as the villain in my own story. I accepted that some people would not understand my silence or my distance, but choosing yourself sometimes means being comfortable with being misjudged, because the alternative is betraying yourself for approval. There was strength in that acceptance, a quiet strength that did not need validation. I did not need to announce my decision, I simply needed to live it. I felt something shift inside me that day. A boundary settled into place, not as a wall but as a line, and that line marked the end of what I would endure. Choosing yourself also meant forgiving myself for staying as long as I did, for ignoring signs, for hoping too hard. Forgiveness was part of self-respect. It allowed me to move forward without carrying shame. I knew the road ahead would require consistency. It would require me to honor this choice even on days when loneliness crept in, even on days when nostalgia tried to rewrite the past, but I trusted myself enough to believe that I would remember why I chose this path. That moment became a reference point in my life. Anytime I was tempted to settle, anytime I was tempted to doubt myself, I returned to that decision. I reminded myself that I had already proven I could choose me in the hardest moment. Auntie May would later say that is when you grew up, not in age but in spirit, because adulthood is not about responsibility alone, it is about discernment, it is about knowing when to stay and when to leave. Choosing yourself does not make you selfish, it makes you whole. It allows you to show up in the world without resentment, without bitterness, without losing pieces of yourself to situations that cannot hold you. I walked away from that moment with grief in my chest but clarity in my steps, and clarity is lighter than confusion even when it hurts. That was the day I learned that self-respect is not loud, it does not need witnesses, it is a quiet agreement you make with yourself and keep even when no one is watching. And once you make that agreement, once you honor it in the hardest moment, you never forget how strong you are, because you have felt it, you have lived it, and that strength stays with you long after the pain fades. After choosing myself, I learned that the choice alone was not enough, because choices without structure dissolve under pressure. That is where boundaries entered my life, not as punishment, not as walls, not as weapons, but as quiet lines drawn with care. Auntie May used to say boundaries are the way you lock your door at night, not because you hate the world but because you value your rest, and that truth settled into me slowly as I began to understand that love without limits becomes self-erasure. For a long time I believed boundaries were something harsh people used to push others away. I thought being loving meant being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly understanding, but what I learned was that endless availability teaches people that your needs are optional, and when your needs become optional, your spirit begins to starve. Setting boundaries felt unnatural at first, like learning a new language with my mouth full of fear. I worried about being misunderstood, I worried about being labeled cold or unforgiving, I worried about being alone. Auntie May would look at me and say, "Baby, loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of self-respect," and that sentence rearranged my priorities. Boundaries required me to stop explaining myself excessively, to stop justifying my feelings, to stop negotiating my comfort. I realized that every time I over-explained, I was asking for permission to be okay, and I no longer wanted permission, I wanted peace. I learned that boundaries are clearest when they are calm, when they are spoken without accusation, when they are enforced without drama. They do not need to be defended repeatedly, they simply need to be honored, and if someone refuses to honor them, that is information, not a challenge. At first, enforcing boundaries felt like holding my breath. I expected backlash, I expected anger, I expected guilt trips, but what surprised me was how much lighter I felt even when reactions were uncomfortable, because discomfort with others was easier to carry than discomfort with myself. Auntie May taught me that boundaries reveal relationships, they show you who benefits from your lack of limits and who respects your humanity. When I began setting boundaries, some people leaned in with understanding, others pulled away, and that separation, while painful, was also clarifying. I learned that boundaries are not about controlling others, they are about controlling access, they are about deciding what behavior I allow into my life and what I step away from, and stepping away does not require hatred, it requires honesty. There were moments I felt tempted to bend my boundaries, to keep peace, to soften them, to avoid tension, but every time I considered that, I remembered how peace bought at the cost of self-respect always charges interest later. I decided I would rather deal with short-term discomfort than long-term resentment. Boundaries also taught me patience, not with others but with myself. I had to learn that enforcing a boundary once does not magically retrain patterns. People test what they hope is temporary, and consistency is what turns boundaries into reality. I discovered that saying no is not rejection, it is redirection, it is guiding energy away from what drains you and toward what sustains you, and that shift changed how I showed up in every area of my life. I stopped answering questions that felt invasive. I stopped tolerating jokes that crossed lines. I stopped making space for conversations that dismissed my feelings. These were not dramatic exits, they were quiet choices repeated daily. What surprised me most was how boundaries improved my compassion, because when I was no longer exhausted from overgiving, I had more genuine care to offer. I was not resentful, I was not depleted, I was present. Auntie May would say, when you stop bleeding everywhere, people stop treating you like a wound. Boundaries stopped the bleeding, they allowed healing to happen. There were times when enforcing boundaries meant being misunderstood, and I had to accept that clarity does not guarantee agreement, but agreement is not the goal. Respect is, and if respect is absent, distance becomes necessary. I learned that boundaries are not rigid fences, they are living agreements. They can be adjusted as trust grows or shrinks, but they must be honored to remain meaningful. Boundaries also required me to confront my own patterns, to see where I had trained people to overstep, to acknowledge where I had confused kindness with self-sacrifice, that honesty was uncomfortable but necessary. I realized that protecting my peace was not selfish, it was responsible, because when I am grounded I show up better, I listen better, I love better. Boundaries made me a safer person for myself and others. There was a moment when I noticed how my body responded to boundaries. My shoulders relaxed, my jaw unclenched, my sleep improved, my nervous system finally felt safe, and that safety was worth every awkward conversation. Auntie May said, boundaries are love letters you write to yourself, promising you will not abandon you again, and that is exactly what they became. I stopped chasing people who only showed up when it was convenient. I stopped investing in dynamics that required me to shrink. I stopped excusing behavior that contradicted words. Boundaries taught me that apology without change is manipulation, and that forgiveness does not require continued access. I could release anger without reopening doors. I learned that some people will accuse you of changing when you set boundaries, and they are right. You are changing, you are growing, you are no longer available for what hurts you. There was grief in that growth, because boundaries sometimes mean letting go of familiar relationships, but familiarity is not the same as safety, and I chose safety. I also learned to set boundaries with myself, to stop replaying conversations, to stop blaming myself for others' choices, to stop romanticizing past pain. These internal boundaries were just as important. Boundaries became the structure that held my healing in place. They allowed me to rebuild trust with myself, because every time I honored a boundary, I proved that I could rely on me. Auntie May always said, if you do not protect your peace, no one else will, and living that truth changed how I move through the world. Boundaries did not make my life smaller, they made it clearer. They filtered out noise, they preserved energy, they created space for relationships built on mutual respect. I no longer fear setting them, because I have seen what happens when I do not, and I have felt the freedom that comes when I do. Boundaries are not punishment, they are protection. They are how you say I matter without needing to shout, and once you learn to protect yourself with grace, you stop asking others to do it for you. That lesson reshaped my life quietly, steadily, permanently, and I carry it with me every day as a reminder that peace is not found by pleasing others, but by honoring yourself consistently and without apology. The grief came in waves, not all at once, and not in a way that followed any rules. It arrived in ordinary moments when I least expected it, in the middle of making coffee, while folding laundry, while driving familiar roads that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Grief does that, it hides in routine and then steps forward to remind you that something has changed. Auntie May used to say, grief is love with nowhere to go, and that made sense to me, because what I was mourning was not just a person but a future I had invested in. For a long time I tried to understand grief as something to fix, something to move past quickly, but I learned that grief is not a problem, it is a process. It needs space, it needs honesty, and most of all it needs gentleness. I gave myself permission to feel sad without turning that sadness into an accusation against myself. Self-blame is a tempting companion in grief. It whispers questions that sound reasonable but are rooted in cruelty. What did I miss? What could I have done differently? Why was I not enough? Those questions pretend to offer control, but they actually steal peace. Auntie May taught me that responsibility and blame are not the same thing. Responsibility is about learning, blame is about punishment, and I refused to punish myself for someone else's choices. I noticed how easy it was to rewrite the story in a way that made me smaller, to tell myself that if I had been different, more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, then the outcome would have changed. But that story ignored the truth that betrayal is not caused by inadequacy, it is caused by decisions, and those decisions belong to someone else. Grief without self-blame required me to sit with uncomfortable feelings without attaching a narrative that destroyed my self-worth. It meant allowing sadness without adding shame. It meant letting tears fall without turning them into evidence that I was weak. There were days when grief felt heavy and days when it felt distant, and I learned to respect both. Neither meant I was doing it wrong. Grief does not move in straight lines, it circles, it revisits, it teaches through repetition. Auntie May would remind me that healing is not about erasing pain but about carrying it differently. Over time I learned to hold my grief with compassion instead of judgment. I stopped telling myself to be over it by now. I stopped measuring my progress against anyone else's timeline. One of the hardest parts was grieving without an apology that felt complete, without accountability, without closure, but I learned that waiting for someone else to validate my pain only kept me tethered to it. I had to validate my own experience. I had to say to myself, yes, this hurt, and yes, it mattered. Grief taught me how deeply I had loved, and instead of criticizing myself for that, I honored it. Loving deeply is not a flaw, it is a strength. Even when it is met with betrayal, it means my heart was open, and I would rather heal an open heart than live with a closed one. I also grieved the version of myself that stayed too long, that hoped too hard, that ignored signs. I had to be careful here because this is where self-blame likes to hide, but I chose to see that version of myself with kindness. She did the best she could with what she knew at the time, and when she knew better, she did better. Auntie May said, speak to your past self the way you would speak to a child learning to walk. You do not scold them for falling, you encourage them to stand again. I carried that wisdom with me as I looked back on my choices. Grief without self-blame meant separating facts from fantasies. The fact was that trust had been broken. The fantasy was that I could have prevented it by being more something. The fact was that I was hurt. The fantasy was that my hurt meant I was deficient. Letting go of those fantasies freed me. I learned to notice when my inner voice turned harsh, and when it did, I gently redirected it. I reminded myself that accountability does not require cruelty. I could learn lessons without tearing myself apart. There were moments when grief felt lonely because people around me wanted me to be strong, to move on, to stop talking about it, but Auntie May taught me that strength is not silence. Strength is honesty, even when it makes others uncomfortable. I allowed myself to grieve publicly and privately. I shared when I needed support, and I sat quietly when I needed solitude. Both were valid, both were necessary. As time passed, grief softened. It did not disappear, but it changed texture. It became less sharp, less consuming. I could think about what happened without my chest tightening, and that shift did not come from forgetting. It came from understanding. Understanding that betrayal did not define my worth. Understanding that pain did not cancel my value. Understanding that healing was not a race. Grief also taught me patience with others. I became more compassionate toward people carrying invisible losses because I knew how heavy unseen grief can be. I realized that grief without self-blame allowed room for gratitude, not for the pain itself but for the clarity it brought, for the strength it revealed, for the boundaries it helped me build. Auntie May would say, you do not thank the storm but you respect what it showed you about your foundation. That made sense to me. I respected what grief showed me about my resilience. I learned that grief can coexist with joy. There were days when I laughed and then felt guilty for laughing, but I released that guilt. Joy is not a betrayal of pain, it is evidence of healing. Grief without self-blame meant allowing happiness back in without suspicion. It meant trusting that feeling good did not mean I was minimizing what happened. It meant understanding that life continues to offer beauty even after disappointment. I also learned to forgive myself for the days I felt stuck, for the days I cried again, for the days I missed what was familiar. Healing is not linear, and regression is often just reflection. Auntie May said, when you stop blaming yourself, grief turns into wisdom, and I saw that happen slowly. The pain became a teacher instead of a jailer. I gained insight into my needs, my boundaries, my values. I learned what I require to feel safe and respected. I learned what I will no longer accept. Grief without self-blame gave me my confidence back because I was no longer questioning my worth. I was honoring my experience. I came to understand that I could grieve fully and still move forward. I did not have to choose between mourning the past and building a future. I could do both. In time, grief became quieter, not gone but gentle. It walked beside me instead of sitting on my chest, and that is when I knew healing was happening. I did not rush that process. I did not shame myself through it. I allowed it to unfold naturally because healing done with kindness lasts. That is the power of grieving without self-blame. It allows you to emerge softer but stronger, tender but grounded, and when grief finally loosens its grip, you are not left empty, you are left wiser, more compassionate, and deeply connected to yourself. And that connection becomes the foundation for everything that comes next. Grief eventually made room for something else, and that something was strength, not the loud kind, not the performative kind, but a quiet steady rise that happened while no one was watching. Auntie May always said the strongest growth happens underground, where nobody claps and nobody sees, and that is exactly how it unfolded for me. I did not announce my healing, I lived it in small decisions, in daily discipline, in choosing myself again and again. At first the rise felt invisible. I was still tired, still sad, still unsure, but I noticed that I was waking up with a little more breath in my lungs. I noticed that my thoughts no longer circled the same questions all day. I noticed that I could sit in silence without replaying every moment. These were not victories anyone would post about, but they mattered. The quiet rise began when I stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. I stopped wanting to be seen as strong or healed or unbothered. I focused on being honest with myself. I focused on consistency. I focused on peace. Auntie May said peace is built, not discovered, and I built mine one choice at a time. I rebuilt routines first because structure gives the heart something to lean on. I ate better, slept better, moved my body even when motivation was low. I kept promises to myself, even small ones, and every kept promise stitched trust back into my spirit. There was a moment I realized I was no longer checking my phone for messages that would never come. That realization did not hurt the way I expected it to. It felt neutral, and neutrality felt like freedom. I knew then that detachment had begun, not from anger but from acceptance. The quiet rise also meant redefining joy. I stopped waiting for happiness to feel big and dramatic. I learned to appreciate ordinary calm, a clean room, a good meal, a deep breath without tension. Auntie May used to say joy does not need fireworks, sometimes it needs rest. I noticed how my voice changed when I spoke about the past. It became steadier, less emotional, less charged. That did not mean I minimized what happened, it meant it no longer controlled me. I stopped telling the story to seek validation. I told it only when it served healing, and sometimes I did not tell it at all. I allowed it to belong to me, not to the audience. The quiet rise showed me that healing is not about erasing scars, it is about no longer bleeding from them. My scars became reminders, not wounds. They told me where I had been and what I survived. I also noticed how my standards shifted without effort. I no longer felt the need to explain my boundaries, they were simply there, and when someone crossed them I stepped back without debate. That calm response was something I once thought impossible. Auntie May would smile and say, "See how far you have come when chaos no longer excites you," and she was right. I was no longer drawn to intensity disguised as passion. I chose stability, clarity, respect. The rise was quiet, but it was real. I laughed more easily. I rested without guilt. I trusted my intuition without second-guessing it. That trust was everything. I began to see myself not as someone who had been hurt, but as someone who had healed. That identity shift changed how I moved through the world. I was not cautious, I was conscious. I no longer measured my worth through someone else's attention. I measured it through alignment, how I felt in my body, how I slept at night, how I spoke to myself. There was pride in that rise, but not arrogance, pride rooted in self-respect, pride that did not need witnesses. Auntie May always said, when you rise quietly you rise permanently, and I believe that because nothing built in noise ever felt this solid. That quiet rise became my new normal, and from that place everything else in my life began to align naturally, without force, without chasing, without proving. I did not just survive, I stabilized. I did not just heal, I matured. I did not just move on, I moved forward. And that is the power of the quiet rise. It does not announce itself, it reveals itself over time in how peacefully you live and how confidently you protect the life you rebuilt from the inside out. The rise did not end with stability, it continued into something deeper, a reshaping of identity, a redefinition of what strength looked like. When it was no longer fueled by pain, I began to notice that my choices were coming from a place of fullness instead of fear, and that shift changed everything. Auntie May always said, when you heal you stop negotiating with your future, and that truth became real in my daily life. I started trusting my instincts without asking for confirmation. I no longer needed permission to walk away from situations that felt off. I no longer explained my boundaries as if they were suggestions. My no became complete sentences, and my yes carried intention. There was a freedom in realizing I did not need to prove how much I had grown. Growth showed itself quietly, in the absence of chaos, in the presence of calm, in the way I handled disappointment without unraveling. I began to choose relationships based on consistency instead of intensity. I noticed how peaceful connections felt unfamiliar at first because my nervous system had been used to highs and lows, but over time peace stopped feeling boring and started feeling safe. The quiet rise taught me discernment. I no longer confused charm with character or attention with affection. I paid attention to how people treated me when there was nothing to gain. That became my measure. I learned that my worth was not tied to being desired or chosen, it was rooted in being aligned with myself, and alignment brought confidence that did not depend on validation. Auntie May used to say, when you stop chasing you start attracting, and that became true not just in relationships but in opportunities, friendships and joy. I was no longer forcing outcomes, I was allowing them. I noticed that my energy changed. I was no longer drained by interactions that once exhausted me because I was no longer overextending. I gave what felt natural, not what felt obligatory. There was also forgiveness that came naturally, not as a requirement but as a release. I forgave not to reconcile but to unclench. Forgiveness became a way to free myself from carrying old weight. The rise meant reclaiming parts of myself I had set aside. I returned to interests I had abandoned, passions I had postponed, dreams I had minimized. I realized how much of myself I had tucked away to fit into spaces that could not hold me. I became more present with my life. I listened better, laughed harder, rested deeper. There was a sense of inhabiting my own body fully again. I also learned humility and strength. I did not need to dominate conversations or assert my growth. I allowed others to be where they were without trying to fix or rescue. That was a boundary too. The quiet rise changed how I handled setbacks. When something did not work out, I no longer took it as a personal failure. I saw it as redirection. That perspective saved me from spirals. Auntie May said, maturity is knowing the difference between what you can change and what you must accept. I practiced that daily, and with practice came peace. I noticed that my inner dialogue softened. I spoke to myself with patience, with encouragement, with respect. That voice became my anchor. I stopped revisiting the past to punish myself. I visited it only to learn, and once the lesson was learned, I let the memory rest. The rise also brought gratitude, not forced gratitude, not spiritual bypassing, but genuine appreciation for where I stood, for how far I had come, for the resilience I had developed. I understood that strength does not mean never hurting again. It means trusting yourself to handle whatever comes without losing yourself. I felt grounded in a way I never had before, not because life was perfect but because I was centered. Auntie May always said, when you build your life from the inside out, no storm can knock it down completely, and I felt that truth in my bones. The quiet rise became my foundation. It supported every decision, every relationship, every dream. It reminded me that I am capable of rebuilding no matter what I lose. I stopped fearing endings because I trusted beginnings. I stopped clinging because I trusted my ability to stand alone. There was a calm confidence in knowing that my peace was self-generated, that no one could give it to me and no one could take it without my consent. I became intentional with my time, protective of my energy, selective with my commitments. These were not restrictions, they were acts of self-respect. The rise meant showing up for my life fully present, fully awake, fully engaged. I no longer lived in anticipation of what might happen. I lived in appreciation of what was happening. I accepted that healing did not make me immune to pain. It made me resilient. It made me flexible. It made me wise. I understood that my story did not end with betrayal. It expanded beyond it. It became richer, more honest, more grounded. The quiet rise taught me that survival is not the goal, wholeness is, and wholeness comes from choosing yourself consistently, not once but always. I carried Auntie May wisdom with me like a compass, reminding me to stay rooted, to speak truth, to protect peace. The rise was not about becoming someone new. It was about returning to who I was before I learned to doubt myself. And in that return I found strength that did not need to shout, resilience that did not need applause, and peace that did not need permission. That is how the journey settled, not with fireworks but with steadiness, not with noise but with knowing. I rose quietly, and because of that I rose securely, and that rise continues every day in the way I live, the way I love, and the way I honor myself without hesitation, without apology, and without ever shrinking again.